First of all, he said, if you can learn a simple trick, Scout, you'll get along a lot better with all kinds of folks. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it.
Hi, my name is Matthew, and
I'm Thomas, and we are from the Chattanooga Public Library. And today we're going to be talking about To Kill a Mockingbird, civil rights, and hashtags. So first, let's go over To Kill a Mockingbird. To Kill a Mockingbird was a novel by Harper Lee, and the story takes place in a small town in the 1930s. The story is narrated by a 6-year-old Scout Finch. Other main characters include Atticus, her father, who's a lawyer, her brother Jim, and his friend Dill, Boo Radley, who's a recluse, and Tom Robinson. Most of the book revolves around the case of Tom Robinson, who's a black man who is wrongly accused of raping a white woman. Atticus becomes Tom's lawyer, and in doing so, Scout sees how a lot of the residents of their town are racist. So Scout is even made fun of at school for her father defending a black man, and oftentimes throughout the book, Atticus serves as the voice of moral good throughout the story. And there's strong lessons of tolerance, empathy, and understanding to be learned. So it's important, especially the time area, which is civil rights, which Matthew, I'll let you talk about a little bit.
To Kill a Mockingbird was published in 1960. Now you have to think that this was during the peak time of the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was a struggle for social justice that took place mainly during the 1950s and 1960s, although many people were still fighting for expanded rights today. The goal was for Black Americans to gain equal rights in America. Jim Crow laws still affected the South, segregation still existed, interracial marriage was legal in some states. Black Americans generally just had less opportunity for success, and the Civil Rights Movement was the main goal to fix this. 1960 is an important year because this is when you start seeing sit-ins throughout the South. Chattanooga had its own successful sit-ins that were started by Howard High School students and took place at local diners downtown. This was after the Ward versus Brown case, so school segregation was slowly being ended, and federal troops were escorting students into schools for the first time. And this was a few years after Rosa Parks, sat on the front of the bus and refused to give up her seat. And this was also a few years after Martin Luther King and several other civil rights leaders got together down in, I believe it was Atlanta.
This book was released in the midst of the civil rights movement, and it was directed mostly at Southern white people at the time, through Scout, who is a relatable character to most Southerners. The book shows the realities of what it was like in small towns in the 1930s and even in the 1960s when it was released, and how dangerous racist thinking can be. So, where do we go from here?
So let's think a little bit about the civil rights movement and compare a little bit to some of the protests that are taking place today. So, in 1960, this is before cell phones. This is before the internet. Communication had to be a challenge, and a lot of times the way communication was taking place was, mail was huge in circulating letters and things like that. Telephones were not quite as common, but they were around, and so you really have to think about the communication then versus now. Now, when a movement starts taking place, when a catalyst to a movement occurs, people will create a hashtag for it. And this connects people and these different hashtags. For instance, after the Parkland shooting, the hashtag March for Our Lives was created. Anyone that wanted to know about the movement, the direction it was going to, what was happening live, could be on Twitter and following this hashtag March for Our Lives. During the Black Lives Matter movement, if you were to look up that hashtag, you would follow the movement live from its various different stages. A few years ago, and Colin Kaepernick taking a knee, to the shootings taking place, the essentially executions taking place in the North and all around the United States. You could follow those events live with various hashtags. Now, words are powerful. If words are used at a certain time, catchy phrases, hashtags, and things like that, with a proper catalyst, it can start a whole movement and connect thousands and millions of people and start movements all across the world. Now, let's take what we know now or how we communicate now and apply that to the book. What if they had hashtags in the 1960s or during, or in the book To Kill a Mockingbird? What kind of hashtags do you think they would use? I personally think, Free Tom Robinson would be a good one. And I think hashtag Real Courage would be a great hashtag, which is actually going to be in one of the passages that we are going to have read here in a little bit. And Privileged Jury, because in the book, the entire jury was actually white. Now, the way they select jurors, and the reason for the hashtag is because they were selected based on property taxes and who paid property taxes. Well, you think about who owned property during the 1960s for the most part. And so therefore, Tom Robinson was not being judged by a jury of his peers, but by a group of privileged people that own property.
I created some similar hashtags. Free Tom. To Kill a Mock.
We're sorry, UTC fans.
Hashtag Civil Rights, just because the book is tied so much in with the Civil Rights movement. But now I think we should move into listening to a few passages from the book. And if you haven't already read it, you can get a couple ideas to create your own hashtags from, and maybe get a better understanding of the concept behind the book.
Now be sure to tag us on social media, on Facebook and Instagram, when you come up with your hashtags for either what hashtags they might have used during the Civil Rights Movement. And we might promote the catchiest one, who knows. And also any hashtags you can come up with for To Kill a Mockingbird, some that we didn't come up with, something that's probably 10 times better than the ones I've chose. But please tag us on social media with your best hashtags.
Hashtag Real Courage. She had her own views about things, a lot different from mine maybe. Son, I told you that if you hadn't lost your head, I'd have made you go read to her. I wanted you to see something about her. I wanted you to see what real courage is, instead of getting the idea that courage is a man with a gun in his hand. It's when you know you're licked before you begin, but you begin anyway, and you see it through no matter what. You rarely win, but sometimes you do. Mrs. DuBose won, all 98 pounds of her. According to her views, she died beholden to nothing and nobody. She was the bravest person I ever knew. From Chapter 11.
Hashtag Privileged Jury. But there is one way in this country in which all men are created equal. There is one human institution that makes a pauper the equal of a Rockefeller, the stupid man the equal of an Einstein, and the ignorant man the equal of any college president. That institution, gentlemen, is a court. It can be the Supreme Court of the United States, or the humblest JP court in the land, or this honorable court which you serve. Our courts have their faults, as does any human institution. But in this country, our courts are the greatest levelers, and in our courts, all men are created equal. From Chapter 20.
So what would the world of Atticus and Scout look like if hashtags had existed? The fight for Tom Robinson's freedom would have sparked outrage across the country as many 1930s civil rights activists followed and joined the movement on Twitter. Here, we imagined their condemnation of the privileged jury and calls for justice using famous quotes from their books and speeches.
thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on the future.